Right. Well, firstly, I must thank Jill for the opportunity to be able to talk about the Argus project, which has dogged my life for some 32 years since Chernobyl, as I think the subject has so many here. The one thing that I wanted, well, three things that I want to talk about. Now, if I can get the right buttons on this, I want to talk a bit about how it came to be that we set up the Argus project in the first place, and then I want to talk about what we've arrived at in terms of the online website and facility, the tool which is there for others to use, freely use, and just to consider possibilities for the future, including what I'm loosely talking about as a pod for monitoring gamma radiation, and it as a portable and reasonably high resolution device. Now, I've chosen this slide because it came as rather a shock to me when I saw it, and quite fascinated by it as an image. But it sums up, I think, our feelings as families at the time in 1986, the very day that we heard about the event in Chernobyl, when I was working on a film which was my background in film production and its technology, and I'd heard that from the producer we were making a film about open cast coal mining in Durham. And he got out of the car, we'd been on a convoy to another location, and he said, "Have you heard the news? There's been a nuclear reactor exploded in Russia behind the Iron Curtain." And he was getting news by the half hour. It so turned out that he was involved in the Druridge Bay campaign, and they had a radiation monitor, a Geiger counter called a Mini 680, that they'd been provided for by the union that produced the turbines for nuclear power stations, and they were monitoring under John's oversight the gardens of people in the region who were concerned that there might be a nuclear power station built in Druridge Bay. And there was certainly talk of it and a lot of concern as to where it may have been at that time. That very night that we heard about it, myself and a couple of concerned friends as well, who also had children on the way, as did I and my partner then, we headed off to find this Geiger counter, as he was the producer of the company, this film, happened to be the chairman of that campaign. And we looked at the Geiger counter, we headed up into Northumberland, we found the Geiger counter. John had given them advice on how to use it that week as the news was coming in, to record daily, not just people's gardens, to find out the baseline for future possible increases if the nuclear power station were to be built, and to oversee any danger that might have occurred from that. And he'd instructed them to take daily readings at the same time every night for the following, well, weeks to come. And we watched those readings, and through that week, on the Saturday, we saw the background readings go up by 80%. And they stayed that high for an entire month. Well, they dropped back a bit after a couple of weeks, and we kept looking at the readings, and then eventually they dropped down to the baseline as the contamination was washed into the ground. Now, none of us who were watching those readings at that time really understood anything about radiation. I had a minimal understanding of it because as a kid I was taken up to Harrods. I lived in Kent, and I was told by my father, "Don't put your feet under the pedescopes," as exciting as it was, because you could see your bones in your feet and you could see the fit of your shoes. He said, "If you do that, the hairs in your legs will fall out." So that was rather an alarming experience. Now we're talking about.
Are you going to show us your non-hairy legs?
Well, I don't have very hairy legs. It was in the 50s, and the situation then occurred where the three of us that grouped together, we said, look, this. Well, we looked at. Well, no, we were at the place where the Mini 680 radiation monitor was located, looking at the readings and so on. And I happened to open the manual for it, and looking at the end of it, I saw a circuit diagram. And my interest in Geiger counters was rather peculiar, because when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I remember going up to London, getting a Geiger tube, a Geiger Muller tube, and bringing it home because I'd read in a wireless world, I'd seen a discussion about building a Geiger counter using one of these tubes, and I thought, looking at the diagram, from that past experience of trying to build a Geiger counter, which fortunately I didn't succeed in doing, because on reflection my father certainly didn't advise me anything, but he didn't realise I could have killed myself with the voltages that it was developing, the way it was being built. It didn't work. But at the time of looking at the diagram, when we were looking at the Geiger counter, I'm thinking to myself, we could build that. And so we set out to do it. And I managed to get together the components. We bought one of the probes from Mini Instruments, who built that Geiger counter in question. We got a little coil which enabled us to develop the necessary voltages, and there it was, a working Geiger counter, a bit crude in the way it was assembled in a box and so on. But it gave us an idea that we ought to put this information we were seeing, these readings, up on a big building and let everybody see it. And I think the wisdom of John's advice was, you cannot do that. You cannot just put this information out there. We even had a building in mind where we were going to put large numerals up, illuminated numerals. But he said, you've got to have more than one. And sure enough, we set out to try and build another one, but we could not even afford a computer or anything that we could use to connect these things together to be able to know what was going on between them, in order to get them in different locations. And we got to the point where I met somebody at the university where I was teaching. I was teaching in the arts field, in a college of art, essentially, but I had the good fortune of being able to go into the canteen and talk to various scientists and engineers, and I was introduced to a man who had said, well, let's talk about what you'd need to do this. And then gradually, as we were talking about it more, he said, hang on a minute, to keep my name out of this, I don't want to have any... I'm not sure my wife would be too happy about me doing this, and I don't want my brake pipes cut, because there was so much suspicion about the fact that we were trying to look at nuclear radiation in the environment, that we were dealing with people in the background who might be the military or the nuclear industry, and he was very apprehensive about this, but he was brilliant at designing electronic equipment. And I had the interest in electronics. We spent 3 months together, because we couldn't afford to buy a BBC Micro, designing a computer from scratch. And once he'd done that, suddenly I thought, well, I'm going to have to build this damn thing. So I set about etching circuit boards, laying out the acetates with all the tracks on it and so on. And in the end, succeeded in building the components, putting them into a box, and thinking, well, what's it going to do? There was no program, there was nothing for it. At which point, a colleague who was a programmer, one of the three of us, set about trying to write a program to burn a little chip to plug into it, and he came round one night with his chip. He said, okay, let's plug that in. And you're sort of looking at it, you press the button, you turn the power on, you press the button, nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. And you think, well, what do you do now? It's a box of bits and we don't know anything about it, apart from the fact it should do something. And then he called me from the other room and he said, it did something, it did something. And I said, well, what's that? He said it turned one of the little lights on the front, because I put 2 LEDs on it. And I'm sort of thinking, really? I mean, he said, yes, that's what it was meant to do. That's it, it's working. And it was the birth of a computer. It was an amazing experience, actually, on reflection, because in those days, it was quite something to try and put together a computer. It worked essentially first time. He made one little mistake, and it was to do with the reset button. After 3 months' work and the building of the components, etching the circuit boards, drilling the holes, soldering in the components and so on. And then we had to write a program for it. My colleague, he wrote a program for it to work with modems, which then, equivalent I guess to routers these days, worked at 300 bits per second. Now we're talking about 20 megabits, 60 megabits. It's totally different. The whole thing was pretty difficult to deal with. But when I mean, the thing was, we bought a modem. It cost 400 quid at the time. We could hardly afford that, so it was using. I was working on sound jobs, on films and so on, so I managed to plough a bit of money in here and there. But the thing was, I started to think back to when I was about 7, when I remember having tubs in the fridge. We used to have tubs of condensed milk, and we lived in Kent. And I learnt from my mother that my father had actually given a talk to the parents of the school that I was at, the infant school that I was at, about the dangers of eating fresh vegetables. Now he worked in the Ministry of Information at the time. He knew something other people didn't know, but he could talk about the dangers of radioactive material. And this is probably why he was telling me not to put my feet under pedescopes. So anyway, we eventually decided we got these different machines working. Reading bought one, and fortunately, and so grateful, Sally and her husband had bought one that we put in oh God, I forgot the name of the lock. Holy Lock, with this nuclear submarine in front of us. There's a certain nervousness about the fact we were looking around. Now, where we put this, we look to see who's looking at us and so on and so forth. But we did. We got it running there, and her son, at about 7 years old, climbed underneath the floorboards to actually get a cable out to the garden, because the one thing that I'd found out was from the National Physical Laboratory back in the early 1980s, they set out a standard by which you should be monitoring the background gamma radiation levels, and you should be doing that. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist, I knew nothing about this at the time, that you need to be able to isolate the readings from the beta if you're aiming at the gamma, and you need to set it about 1.5 meters above the ground, and ideally with the largest tube that you could use, which was practically available and economically available. And that was in fact the very same tube that we bought from for the initial design, and it was also the same tube that the government radiation network, which eventually came about after ours started in the early 90s, had been using. Unfortunately, all the tubes we ever bought, sadly for the people who'd got the stations in time, at that time, all failed. They were a British manufacturer. They went from one manufacturer to another manufacturer. They got more and more expensive. Every single one of them failed within either minutes, hours, or days and even years. They all failed. However, we did move to, in 1996, we used tubes that came from America, from a company called LND, and not one of them has failed once we got past the first hurdles. And they worked ever since, and I believe there are probes out there that could still be deployed of that type that otherwise have fallen by the wayside. Now I want to show you what we've now arrived at in terms of presenting the data, because in the early days we set up a bulletin board system where people could log in, but nobody really knew how to do it. They didn't even understand what modems were, I found. And local authorities, one or two of them, were quite enthusiastic about the idea. Reading bought a station, and they were constantly looking at the data and phoning me up every other day. Anyway, what we've arrived at now, if I can move forward, let's find the right buttons, is that, well, by the time we'd built several of these stations, and by 1989, we had so many people had become involved in helping with the project that we felt morally obliged to respect their input and wanted to have some way of consolidating our thinking behind the project at that point in time. And these were the objects of a trust which a lawyer who I found at the university, well, the Polytechnic that I was working at the time, sort of offered to write up for us. And it took several weeks before we finally came up with this, where everybody came together at a meeting at my house, and this is what we arrived at. And I think it's relatively clear. So we set out the idea that we had to sort of bring all the data together from all the different stations that we were building, and to archive that data and in a scientific way provide the ability to provide the methodology of collection to be available for everyone, and also to set out to try and disseminate the data for others to use, and not to undertake any license that threatened any of those objects of the trust. But one thing that did get written into it, which I think is extremely important, is that while we ourselves might have been in some respects activists in this whole arena, we felt that we weren't in a position to make any judgments of this data. It's for others to be able to do that, and so this was written in as a very important clause to the project's, well, the trust's objects. Now I'm going to just give a very quick rundown. Here's the order of events that the project went through, and you can see the date at which the trust was formed, and I can say the very year that we started the project was the year, of course, of Chernobyl, and it was the first low-level radiation and health conference that we attended. And I remember only too well standing up and there was about 200 people there, if I remember, and I picked the microphone up, well, I was given the microphone, and nervously I stood in front of everybody and I said, look, we've got this far in monitoring with these stations, but what are the units that we need to use? How do we interpret any of this? What do we do? We knew we had to do something. And anyway, we were advised on this and that. And at a later conference, I turned up, I think it was Norwich. I put a little handout to people to say, well, what sort of name can we give the project? And it was sent to me that we should call it the Argus Project, after the Argus peacock with all the eyes that were forever looking, that they, as I understand the story, he was responsible for looking after the safety or chastity of, was it Io? I don't know the Greek mythology, or if I did, I've forgotten it. And failed, had 50 eyes open, 50 eyes closed, and in the end actually closed all his eyes, fell asleep, and then the eyes that you see on the peacock were where they were all intended to be left open and forever vigilant. So it was a valuable thing. It was the automated radiation gamma something, and I can't remember what it was. But so that was the birth of the project. And in the 90s we developed a multi-channel monitoring system, not just for gamma. We found the importance of monitoring weather parameters at the same time at the location, so that one could determine what the rainfall was, because people were now starting to talk about the relationship, as John has, between the radioactivity in the washout from the rain and the increase in gamma, the onset of the rain being a washout of dust from, particularly in the occluded front situation where there's a lot more activity high up in the atmosphere. So that became very interesting at the time for us, and in the 90s we very ambitiously started to design a remote acid rain monitoring machine that would automatically collect the rain samples and then analyze them, and we would be able to update the system remotely and so on. It did work, but it was too hard to calibrate and it would be too expensive to repeat, and it was a beautiful bit of engineering by one of our members back then. And in the recent years, I can talk about a relationship that we started with Connection Software. I was losing faith in the fact that we couldn't hold the thing together. We had many people involved in the project for so many years, and they went off in their own life to do other things and what have you. They contributed a lot, and many people that I had a server under the stairs. It was hard to keep going. No funds really, apart from a little bit coming in from some councils, because largely speaking, they were council-owned stations, environmental health officers. They moved on, and they often sort of dropped the idea of monitoring. They weren't too keen after the subject ceased to be as sexy as it did in the early days. And then, out of the blue, I had a bit of a guilt thing, because this company's connection software, a fellow called John Cole had contacted us in the mid 2000s and said, look, I've seen what you've got online, which was a rather sort of naff graphing system. He said, look, you need a bit of help. Is there anything I can do to help? It took years before we got to the point where I was absolutely desperate. And he did, when I phoned him up, he'd had a heart attack before then as well. He sort of said, yeah, I'll happily do that. If I can, I've got somebody who might be able to help. And he ended up giving us the support for over a year to build a database system, but no online front end. So it was a bit difficult to use or see what was on it. I asked him if he could help me do a little front end. He said, well, it's costing a bit of money, this. I can't really keep putting these guys onto this. And in the end, I waited months and months. I thought, what can we do now? We hadn't got much money. It turned out that my wife and I, we have an online eBay shop, and she was packing we were packing some toothpaste, and she said, don't you know somebody called John Cole? And I said, yeah, where from? He said, Hatton Garden. She said, Hatton Garden. I said, that's the same guy. I felt so guilty, because I really hadn't got back to him. So I ended up writing frantically a letter, putting it in with the toothpaste, saying, can you help again? We've got some money now from the councils. And sure enough, he phoned me up, he said, certainly can. And from that day onwards, we had a very strong relationship, started to build the ability to see the stations coming and going and be able to sort of maintain them when there were issues. And we ended up then with a situation where we needed a very front end bit for people to see the graphs and be able to play with them. And that's what I want to show you now. Okay, I'll just show you that. These are the people. I've not put their surnames in because a lot of them want to remain anonymous, in fact. But sadly, these have left us now. But these are the people that have been involved in this. And I'm hoping that there will be others in the future, because this new website that we've now got running, it's been going a year or so, but it's only in recent months that it's become a viable thing for people to use as a scientific tool. And that's what I want to show you now. So I'm going to go through it quite quickly.